Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
You know, it really serves like an endorsement, right? Absolutely shouldn't have been this hard. It's just that people got discouraged along the way.
What do folks like you or the city have to do to not let this opportunity pass us by?
This is a defining moment. When you have this much activity and synergy happening in a particular space, you have to capitalize on it. We laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny then. In 2016, when we bought that first house, you couldn't get a bank to look our way.
I'm Danny Wicentowski. On Monday last week, Andre Alexander, lead pastor of the Tabernacle Church in St. Louis, stepped into a bank branch to make a deposit. It wasn't an everyday transaction, but part of the branch's grand opening. And the location, inside a former elementary school in the JeffVanderLou neighborhood, which had sat vacant for more than a decade after it closed in 2002. But now, some 20 years later, and with more than $1 million invested in its rehab, the building is now a community center, and it's become a hub for an ambitious set of efforts to revive and rebuild the neighborhoods around it. And in fact, the hub is the name of that community center. It's not just a bank branch. Since its opening in December, the hub has added a medical clinic run by Mercy Health Systems, social workers that are on site, as well as legal aid and a speech therapy center from Maryville University. There are just a lot of things happening at the hub, and that activity is part of the sweeping vision that's driving it. And to talk about that vision, we welcome Andre Alexander. Pastor Andre, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today.
Andre, as we mentioned, you are the lead pastor of Tabernacle Church, and you were among those that founded that church around 2012. But just a couple years later, you helped found the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation, and you combined some of the faith mission with a much larger kind of vision for the economic needs and the development needs of the area around you. What brought you to that moment to combine those two missions?
Great question. For me, it is all tied to my faith beliefs. And I believe faith can be tangible, and I believe it is tangible. And it's hard to talk about a God that loves you if you never see the love of that God. And I think through economic development and empowerment, that's one of many ways we get to see God's love. And so for us and for me as a leader, it was an easy blend when we looked around and saw need. And after community conversation, because we didn't want to just plunge in and just do things. This community had been through that already, where people just did things, but never was inclusive. And so after a lot of conversations, it was like, this is the right thing to do.
And just to define sort of what this development corporation does, you have the church, of course, called the Tabernacle, but what does a community development corporation do?
Great question. We do a few things. So one of those things is we do housing, not just affordable housing. You know, affordable sometimes can be a buzzword. Affordable to us means a house that's safe and quality where families can thrive where they live. So we're into that. We're also into youth and education. So we offer two programs. One of them is called Scholarship Search Initiative, where we actually work with a small cohort of juniors or seniors in high school every year. And it's not just helping them find scholarships, although that's a key component. It's helping them develop life skills. It's helping them be ready to do what we call the next step, whether that's a 2-year university, 4-year university, or a tech program, whatever that is, we help them take that step. We also help with scholarship initiative called Valuable Scholarship, where we're looking for students. They don't have to be the A+ student. We're looking for students who are working hard and who need a little assistance to further their education. And then the last thing that we do is engage people, meaning movie nights, school drives, food, utility assistance, neighborhood parties, just things that are the sweet spot of building camaraderie amongst people. That's what we do.
And along with camaraderie, you are building houses. You are rehabbing these homes. There is certainly this community building aspect in the hub. But I'd love to get a sense that you are posting these videos to your social medias, and you're walking into these homes that they're being framed up. They're getting drywall in there. You're talking about the ACs being put in there. And these are homes that have had, I think, more than 30 families have moved into these units. The building efforts that have gone into this are pretty remarkable. How did you get that momentum going? And tell us a bit about sort of just how many homes or how much impact you've gotten.
Yeah. So I love the homes piece especially. I have to be honest, because it allows me to blend both worlds for me. And here's what I mean. So I call it my former life. Before being a pastor, I was in corporate America as well as somewhat of the nonprofit sector as well. But I have a background in electrical engineering and construction and project management. I also have an MBA. And so you mix that with working with people, and housing is the greatest place to do it because I get to build things but also work with families. And so you're right. We've had the opportunity to rehab 13 homes. We're finishing up, as we're talking about this, we're finishing up 3 and we're starting another 2. Actually starting another 3. So by the time this year is over, we would have completed somewhere around 18 rehabs. That has allowed us to house over 35 families. That has allowed us to create 103 construction jobs, many of them local people who live in the neighborhood or their office for their businesses in the neighborhood. It's allowed us to help minority businesses because we give opportunities where some don't get it. So like we've had as high as 80% minority participation. And you're right, we walk in these homes and every home I just talked about was vacant. It was a vacant, boarded up, sometimes in some areas, coming apart. And we put it back together. We restore it. And the beauty of doing that is it casts hope to people. But here's the other piece that I like as well. It helps with what I call, and many call it this too, environmental justice, which means you keep things out of landfills, you keep contaminants out of the air because we're restoring spaces instead of demoing spaces.
That subject of vacancy, it's such a theme that comes up when we talk about the conditions of neighborhoods like JeffVanderLou, and that impression that a lot of people have, which is that this is an area that is perhaps too far gone, too many people have left. But that is not the lesson that you took when you saw that area.
Yeah. For me personally, I always saw it as a place of opportunity. And I think part of it is, I'll admit, my own bias. And what I mean is, my wife grew up in this neighborhood where we are. My dad grew up in this neighborhood. My mom, in her early years, in her 20s, lived in this neighborhood. And so I know the value and the history and the richness of culture. And while some structures are missing, I still see that culture. I still see that hope. I still see that sparkle. And what I was able to do with a team of people, I have a great team that I get to work with, is put on paper this vision for what would it look like to rebuild, and then connect with different people to share it with them. So I share it with whoever I can, and it just so happened that I was able to share it with some people who bought into it, and that helped us get some momentum early on back in 2016. That's when we bought our first house in 2016.
At the time, should mention that you were you were a church, essentially. You were this new group, but you were relying on private donations. You were not getting a lot of buy-in. And it sounded like, from some of the earlier interviews that you did, that you were hoping that there would be more banks or credit available and things you just weren't seeing at the time. What position did that put you in, and how did you get those resources, that money, really, that we're talking about, to turn these buildings into something livable?
Yeah, great question. So we laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny then. In 2016, when we bought that first house, you couldn't get a bank to look our way. And at that time, you really couldn't get much philanthropy to look our way either. It was really through what I call divine connection of meeting Kyle McLennan and Bridget McLennan, who are the founders of Brace for Impact, a foundation. And they had been doing a lot of work in Haiti, and they really wanted to do some work local because they're both from St. Louis. Kyle's a former Cardinals player, played on the 2011 championship team. He wanted to do something in his home, and he wanted to partner with someone who he could work alongside with together. And so a mutual acquaintance put us together. And they were what I would call and still are early adopters and supporters of us to this day. And through that relationship, we used to do pre-COVID what we call road shows. We would go talk to any business, any corporation, any private person who was willing to listen to what we were trying to do. And through those road shows, we began to develop momentum in gifts and fundraising, and we raised dollars. The first, I want to say, probably 5 homes that we did were all raised privately. It was all private funding, nothing from any state source, local source, any of that.
Now, that has changed somewhat recently. In just last year, so the Post-Dispatch reported that the city's redevelopment arm has gotten involved. And this opens up things like, tax abatements, looking at the property values. What has the city's, entrance into this? What power does that give you in kind of continuing this mission and expanding it just beyond, what your own private donors can give you?
Sure. It really serves like an endorsement, right? Because people have seen us doing this work, but like you mentioned, and talked about it in last year in 2021. So that's 5 years down the road before we get to this point. However, getting there now says, okay, there's going to be some strategic investment. And that strategic investment can be significant now because you have certain resources that you can utilize in a healthy way to maximize community development. So having the city, step in and provide that designation is a key part in keeping the momentum going, because now it allows you to attract even more funding sources.
We're talking to Pastor Andre Alexander, who's the lead pastor of Tabernacle Church and the president of the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation. You just mentioned that it had taken 5 years of doing this work already before the city got involved in designating these areas for redevelopment. And one of the things you did mention is you had hoped more banks would get involved. And there's this history of banks and redlining, who gets mortgages, who doesn't, all of these things kind of playing out in the background until we've seen these records and seen how prevalent and how much they've shaped this city. Does it feel like it didn't have to be this hard, that you didn't have to wait those 5 years for the city to take notice or for a bank to take notice, for that matter? Yeah.
So, absolutely shouldn't have been this hard, right? It's the hardness of it that has discouraged many. We're not the first church or first organization that has tried. It's just that people got discouraged along the way when you don't have the resources you need or the interest that should be there. And so for us, banks came first. As you were at the grand opening last week, First Bank, I said it, First Bank was the first bank to give us a line of credit to do some of the work, and then slowly, more stepped up. And so now we have some pretty significant banking relationships that help us with this work. And I don't, if it's okay, I'd love to name a few just because of them stepping
Please.
up. Of course, as I mentioned, First Bank, Midland States Bank, Great Southern Bank, and UMB Bank, or some significant partners with us in this work. now with city coming, on board, I made the joke to one of the staff, what took you so long? Because, we did a lot of heavy lifting, and it's easy to lose hope when you're doing a lot of heavy lifting and the people you feel like should be engaging don't. But I'll say this, the one thing that was a source of hope and inspiration for us was the community itself saying thank you. People every now and then stopping and saying thank you for doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, to that point, you've built these houses. You have these 30-some units that families have moved in there. What kind of difference does this make for their lives? What are the ripple effects, and what's the bigger kind of web of a community as it becomes built?
Yeah, so the web itself is now you have this ecosystem starting to be formed with housing, because we know that if a family or an individual doesn't have safe housing, they can't address education, they can't address economics, they can't address healthcare, they can't address jobs. And so now what you see happening is, as families have moved in, you're seeing families become stable, and you see children's attendance in school going up. You see parents being able to get better employment. You're seeing families and individuals are able to address healthcare challenges. Here's something else neat you see. You see other homeowners who go, wait a minute, I want my property to look like that. Who do you work with? And we've made connections that way, or some have just started doing stuff like renovations on their homes or updating systems, or outside of the homes, new landscaping, tuck pointing, roofs. So now you're starting to see this ecosystem based on hope of family and community stabilization as we slowly knock down the vacancy totals in our area.
Mm-hmm. And these aren't just in the abstract or theoretical. These are real houses that you've been rehabbing. These are people that are staying in this neighborhood that maybe they would have left. Maybe they would have gone to some other area.
Absolutely. And not to mention people who weren't in the area who moved into our housing. They're new to the neighborhood. That whole idea that everybody's just fleeing away. Well, we can tell you that's not necessarily true. As we've housed people who, like you said, would have left, but we've also housed people who've actually moved from the county to the city to receive quality housing and the resources we've been able to provide.
Mm-hmm. In our last couple of minutes, I wanted to maybe cast our eyes to the future. Even after all of the activity that we've just described that Tabernacle has been doing, this next stage, called the Village, which is a much larger and sweeping kind of redevelopment, that is in the planning stages now. It looks like you've been doing community meetings. There is also looming the NGA West, a huge kind of change in the very landscape of this area. What does this moment feel like, this opportunity, and what do folks like you or the city have to do to not let this opportunity pass us by? Absolutely.
This is truly a defining moment for us in our city. No question about it. Anybody else who says otherwise, I don't know where they're living and breathing. This is a defining moment. When you have this much activity and synergy happening in a particular space, you have to capitalize on it. So for organizations like ours, that means finding strategic ways and strategic partners to step up and do more. And so the Village, as you mentioned, is a part of that do more for us. It was a plan that started last year in May that we finished up this year in March, April. It involved meetings with stakeholders in the community, residents, business owners, other nonprofits, and looking collectively at what they thought community needs were for the long haul. When I say long haul, Village looks at the next 15 to 20 years. What does it look like to have housing, spaces for small business, mixed income developments, places for seniors to not just age in housing, but age in community? I've been here all my life. I shouldn't have to leave. How do we bring additional resources, food, other goods and services in? So the Village lays that out. And the motto is, it takes a village to raise a village, meaning all of us working together to pour back into this space so it can be a safe space for people and places to thrive.
Pastor, One of the most challenging aspects of this whole discussion is that while we're talking about the resources that are hopefully going to be going into North City, the effects of the 15, 20 years down, the last several decades, those resources have been concentrated to such an extent in the Central Corridor, in other parts of the city. Does this feel like playing catch-up, or is there an opportunity again here to really change the way this city looks, and perhaps 20 or 30 years in the future, we won't be looking back at this period the way we do now?
Absolutely. Great question. I think it's both and. It is playing catch-up, significant catch-up. Let's just be clear. We're talking decades of disinvestment, catch-up, and also an opportunity to rewrite policy so that there's strategic investment going forward, so we don't get back here again 20 or 30 years later. And that is my hope.
Mm-hmm. And just in closing, when you think about the hub, think about that area that you're in, opening this bank branch, what does that area look like 15, 20 years down the line if this kind of neighborhood plan really produces the fruit I think that you're hoping it does?
I see a neighborhood where there are people that are from very diverse backgrounds and economic statuses being able to live, thrive in place, being able to walk to the things that they want and or need, being able to live in safe, secure housing, and being able to be proud to call where they live home. That's what I see.
Andre Alexander is the lead pastor of the Tabernacle Church and the president of the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation. Pastor Andre, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This episode was produced by Danny Wysentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.